Hi, this is Kelsey Fikowski for AP Gov Review. And in part four of dealing with the presidency, we're going to be looking at the executive branch. And when we look at the executive branch, most people just think of only the president, but the executive branch actually consists of many, many more people than just the president. So, running the government. So, as chief executive, the president presides over the administration of the government. Remember, in the Constitution, it specifically states that the president is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And how do you do that? Well, that's through the federal bureaucracy, which spends more than 2.5 trillion a year and numbers more than 4 million employees. So the bureaucracy falls under the executive branch and is often referred to as the fourth branch because it really almost operates like another branch, but it is part of the executive branch technically. So the president is in charge of appointing about 500 higher level positions and about 2,500 lesser jobs, but the bureaucracy is, you're looking at many, many employees who make up this branch. So let's first start off with the White House staff. The president has chief aides, also has a large staff because, again, the president is just one person. And think about all the roles that the president fulfills, from the informal roles to the more formal roles. So certainly the president needs some help, cannot do it all by him or herself. So the president does rely on their information and effort, but the presidents are in charge of basically setting the tone and the style of the White House. Some are more strict, some are more laid back and flexible. It really depends on the person. Also, the First Lady plays a role. While it is not technically an official government position, typically each First Lady will take on a unique project. So, for example, here you see Michelle Obama in an episode of Sesame Street promoting healthy foods. That's been her big initiative. So while it isn't an official position, certainly they are getting involved. What is going to be interesting is if there will ever be a first gentleman position, and if there is, you'll probably see something along the same lines. Also, recent ones such as Hillary Clinton, interestingly enough, when her husband Bill was president, she tried to take on healthcare as an issue, which did not work well during that time. Nevertheless, so what is the White House office? It is more administrative and less policy oriented than you see in the executive office. They typically are going to handle the day-to-day presidential activities, and this contains an enormous number of things, from press briefings, dealing with the press, stagings, whether it's going to be giving speeches or promoting a policy around the country, responding to mail. Certainly a lot of mail still comes into the president, coordinating photo ops, research, and even speech writing, amongst numerous other responsibilities, is some of what the White House does. Now, when we look at the executive office, this refers specifically to a set of groups with a specific task on advising the president. So when you look at some of these here, you have the Council of Economic Advisors for economic issues, environmental issues, security, and so on that you see. So really, you have a large number of people playing a major role in terms of advising the president here. Now, in terms of running the government, if you look at the principal offices of the White House, power is flowing from the president. You have the vice president here and the first lady. And then you have the chief of staff and the deputy chief of staff, who are very much in charge of making sure that these offices are running smoothly. But notice just how many different offices are involved. Everyone from the staff secretary to photography to USA Freedom Corps, National Security Affairs, right? There are many, many people involved within the chief executive office. So many, many things to be done. Now, when we look at the vice president, basically does not have too much of a role. You basically wait for things. You can either be the most important person or you can be the least important person. Least important person if nothing happens. Most important person if, let's say, something happens to the president. And as per the 25th Amendment, as you know, the vice president would assume the presidency, as we've seen in the past. So power has grown over time. As recent presidents have given their VPs more important jobs. Again, a lot of it might be campaign stumping. It might be going around the country promoting a policy, but certainly that is the role of the vice president, and also to cast the formal vote in the Senate in the event of a tie, but that does not happen all that much. Also important is the cabinet. These are presidential advisors. These are not technically established in the Constitution. Washington actually, interestingly enough, set this up. And today it is made up of 14 cabinet secretaries and one attorney general, and these all have to be confirmed by the Senate. So when we look at the cabinet departments here, the first one being the Department of State, which is in charge of making foreign policy, including treaty negotiations and so forth. And you notice that they have evolved over the years. And what's interesting here is the last one that was created was the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, and that was the Department of Homeland Security responsible for protecting against terrorism and responding to natural disasters. So these cabinets play a major role in advising the president. Equate it to a principal. The principal cannot be well versed in every single subject from science to special education to math to history. So typically you have department supervisors. You have someone who's in charge of the social studies department. You have somebody who's in charge of the science department. And all those people help to advise the principal, whether, it might be on what textbook to use or, what curriculum standards should be implemented. They are advisors to the principal. In a very similar way, the cabinet departments are advisors to the president. So think of it that way. I would not really be focused on knowing, all of these cabinet departments for the AP Gov exam. I would say certainly the first three here are very important in terms of just knowing what they do. The other ones, I don't think you'll really see that come up, but I would certainly just have a working knowledge of it and what cabinets just generally do. And interestingly enough, about the cabinet positions is that one cabinet member actually stays out of the State of the Union address when the president gives it in January. And some of these you see here, 2013, the Secretary of Energy stayed out. So in the event that hypothetically the State of the Union was bombed and there were no survivors and the vice president is there as well, the person who would become the next president would be the Secretary of Energy, as per the presidential succession of the 25th Amendment. So they always keep one person out, interestingly enough. So it's, that's their chance, really their only realistic chance of becoming president. All right, so the executive office is made up of policymaking and advisory bodies, as we looked at in the previous slides, and here you see some of the major ones. In particular, the National Security Council, very important, created during the Cold War in 1947 to coordinate the president's foreign and military policy advisors. And these include, again, not only just the Secretary of State and Defense, but you're also looking at the Vice President too, so playing a little bit more of a role. The Council of Economic Advisors, also important, providing detailed analysis on current and future trends of the economy, certainly important with the recession back in 2008. And then also the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, as it's well known. And this one you're probably, sometimes this appears on the AP Gov exam as well as the National Security Council, so be aware of that. But the OMB is going to provide the budgetary function, including legislative review, as well as assessments of proposals. So how much will a particular bill cost or a program cost that one might want to implement? So it's almost like the counterpart to the CBO for Congress. In terms of the presidential leadership of Congress, certainly a lot of it comes down to public approval. So if you can get the public on your side, that's really important. It gives the president more leverage, but again, doesn't always guarantee success. Certainly there are, so-called mandates, the perception that the voters strongly support the president's character and policies. One reason why presidents sometimes think they have a mandate from the voters is after they win an election, sometimes the electoral college really skews things. So you might, win by over 100 electoral votes, which is a lot, but when you look at the popular vote and they only won by 2 or 3%, is that really a mandate? But nevertheless, they tend to be infrequent, and as I said just before, you see the mandates increasing as the electoral college victory expands. Oftentimes, presidents will go public. It is a great way to influence the public and, again, sort of even persuade Congress to act. Certainly, you do have staging events where the president is going to give speeches, again, to promote an agenda, promote a particular policy. And as head of the state, presidents often perform many ceremonial functions. Again, they love this favorable press coverage. Now, what's interesting is when you look at presidential approval ratings, this is very important because this really sets the tone. Can a president have the people on his or her side? When you look at George W. Bush, right after 9/11, you see an approval rating just above 70%. Yet when he leaves office in 2008, you see it hovering just around 30%. And this was due to the unpopular war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, depending on whether one's approval rating is higher or lower, it can be based on the honeymoon effect. It could be based on an unpopular war. Again, it really depends on what's going on. And again, as you can see here with the ebb and flow of it, it can highlight good or bad decisions. Many Americans were very, very satisfied by the way George W. Bush handled the aftermath of 9/11, not so much with the war in Iraq as illustrated by the polls. Average presidential polls for the entire term, you do notice that most Americans do approve, just a little bit under 50%, some more popular than others, depending on the term. All right, so in terms of policy support, often presidents will try to gain this support through televised messages. Not terribly successful in doing that, but really the first president to do that was Teddy Roosevelt, and this was known as the bully pulpit, where you would be using the media to help advocate for one's agenda. And Teddy Roosevelt often consulted with the investigative journalists during the progressive era known as muckrakers to really persuade the public support for new reforms, whether it's regulation on the big trusts at that time or in terms of passing the Pure Food and Drug Act. Those were very important, and those would not have really come to fruition if you did not have the use of the press or the bully pulpit, as it was known. Sometimes the public is receptive. It really depends on the issue and how controversial it may be. Take, for example, gun rights. That's very controversial. So the president can try to motivate the public, contact Congress, but this is very difficult, especially as people are becoming a little bit apathetic and distant towards politics, as some have just become jaded by politics. So certainly that can happen. But overall, the president and the press often are adversaries due to different goals, right? The media wants to get out a good story. The president wants to convey his or her message to the public. These can sort of butt heads at times, especially if the media isn't so concerned about policy news in terms of promoting an agenda or promoting a president's policy, but instead wants to promote a more juicy news story. And news coverage of the president has become increasingly more negative, especially since the 1940s, 1950s. A good example of when the media and the president was sort of much closer would be FDR's presidency, where the media never really took a picture of his entire body. Even though they knew that he was suffering from paralysis, they still did not take any pictures below his waist. So again, that would not really happen today. That would be a big front, news story. All right, let's transition now to our review question. So all the following are formal or informal sources of presidential power, except take a moment to look through this. And if you said presidential authority to raise revenue, you are correct. The president does not have the right or the power anywhere in the Constitution, informally or formally, to raise revenue in terms of taxation. Certainly the bully pulpit is an informal source of power to persuade the public, so public support. Constitution certainly gives the president power, and even precedents set by previous administrations, for example, the two-term presidency, or even having cabinets, which is not directly from the Constitution. Nevertheless, that is the best answer.